Welcome back to Christ Table Bible Study. My name's Kevin Young, and I'm grateful to be here with you as lead clergy at Christ Table. If you'd like to know more about Christ Table, all you need to do is visit the URL that is right there, www.christstable.today. Sign up for the email list there so that you will know everything that's going on around Christ Table. If you'd like to know more about this study in particular, that URL right there at the bottom of the screen, go.christstable.today/bittersweet. That's the place to go. Have a couple of free PDFs there that you can download. A schedule of all of the readings and days of this Bible study is available there, as well as a PDF curriculum that'll walk through each and every day and help you go deeper into the study. If you would like a printed copy of that curriculum, we can get that out to you. There's information on that URL about it. In fact, there's an entire box that goes along with it. I've got 1 or 2 boxes left. You can click on the button there that says "Get the Box." That spiritual formation resource box allows us to continue this ministry here, and also gives you some things in order to help you through this journey. One other thing that I want to make sure that you're aware of before we move on: this book may be helpful to you or somebody you know. Reconstruct Your Faith. If you'd like to find out more about it, it's been out a couple of months now. Go ahead and visit the URL, drkevinyoung.com. Now, today we find ourselves making a mess down here on the floor because it didn't quite hit the edge of the desk correctly there. So today we find ourselves continuing on in 1 Peter chapter 2. We're going to close out chapter 2 today on day 10 as we are continuing on through this study of bittersweet, looking at the tension between suffering and what joy or peace might be able to come from it. So we're feeling this tension between the bitter and the sweet of suffering. First Peter is a book that is written to a church that is suffering. We find ourselves today a few verses in chapter 2, verses 18 through 25. And I got to tell you, these verses today, they may hit some buttons. This is a tough passage, a tough chapter. This is one of those ones where I got to say at the very beginning, you may not agree with where I land here. It's a very tough passage. I'm not even sure if I agree with where I land on this one. So we're going to hold to this one loosely. We're going to look at it. I'm going to give you a perspective that I think is going on here and how we can apply it to ourselves. But if you disagree, I'd love to hear it. Place it in the comments or the chat wherever you're watching live or by delay. And you're probably thinking, if you haven't yet read the text or gotten in the study yet, what in the world is he talking about? Well, let's just go ahead and jump in to verse 18. You who are slaves must submit to your masters with all respect. Do what they tell you, not only if they are kind and reasonable, but even if they are cruel. What we want to do here is really just kind of focus on this word slave. Now, I know that in yesterday's conversation, I changed the word out, slave, for servant. That was intentional because it helped us better understand what Peter was trying to communicate by thinking of our relationship with God not as being a slave, but as being a servant. The reason for that is because we don't really have a context here in U.S. America of what it looks like to be a slave. And so to understand what Peter was asking, it's better for us to think of it as servant, because that's something that we can more wrap our minds around. In today's text, we cannot avoid the word slave and should not avoid the word slave because it is critical to what Peter is saying, and it's really not able to be changed out to servant. We can't get around or step aside from the difficulty of this passage or the words or the implications of what Peter has to say here. You who are slaves must submit to your masters with all respect. Do what they tell you, not only if they are kind and reasonable, but even if they are cruel. So Peter is writing to an audience that is mostly slaves, and asking them, in fact, telling them to submit to their masters out of respect. No civil disobedience, no uprising, no revolts. Just do what you're being told, and do what you're told to do as a slave, even if your master isn't kind or isn't reasonable, even if they're cruel. I will admit that I read this passage and my first response to it is not a positive one at all. My first response to this is no, 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 Peter, no. This is an advocation of slavery. And what you've written here, Peter, has been utilized over the years and even now currently to condone slavery, because you did not come out and say that it's not okay. What's being on here is not okay for slavery to happen. I say no, no, no. And this gets into this idea that we've been talking about from the very beginning, but where the rubber meets the road, where it's very difficult, if not impossible, for us to bridge a gap of 2,000 years. We cannot make Peter say what we need Peter to say in order for it to not cause problems today. We get into this a lot, right? With the Bible, we get into this a lot with Scripture, where it's written to the problems and to an audience 2,000 years ago that is not taking into context the problems and the issues and the things that we're going to need to hear to solve our issues 2,000 years later. And we cannot change that. We can try to understand, extrapolate, exegete, but at the end of the day, there is a gap. We just don't know what Peter would say to us today. And were he even to rewrite to this audience, maybe a year or two later, he might write something differently. He might say, you know what? I really need to kind of reframe that. I need to say that differently. We just don't know. So what we have to do is essentially take Peter at face value. We have to try to understand what Peter is trying to communicate. And then from there, we have to make a decision as to what we think about that, how we navigate that, and how we feel about it. So why don't we just go ahead and keep reading? He's just told them that they need to obey their masters, even if their masters are cruel. For God is pleased when, conscious of his will, you patiently endure unjust treatment. Peter's saying it's not right, it's not okay what you're going through, but God sees it and God is pleased with it. That still feels difficult. Why would God be pleased at cruelty to other people? I guess he can be pleased at patiently enduring, but it's a tough pill to swallow. Of course, you get no credit for being patient if you're beaten for doing wrong. Peter has already said in yesterday's text, don't be found doing wrong. Live well, live rightly, so that nothing can be said of you that is truthful but bad. This is now where we begin to see how and why that makes a difference. Don't give anyone any reason to dislike you, but here, taking it a step further, don't give anyone any reason to be cruel to you, because if you're actually being beaten for doing wrong, then you get no credit for being patient with your slave owner, with your master. But, and here's Peter coming back to that original thought from earlier, if you suffer for doing good and endure it patiently, God is pleased with you. Why is God pleased? Shouldn't God fix this? For God called you to do good, even if it means suffering, just as Christ suffered for you. Peter says you're not going to get out of suffering, whether it's slavery or some other thing. You're not going to get out of suffering. And so whatever state that you're in, whatever place that you're in, you have to find a way to do good and to be a good person in that. Peter says Jesus is your example, and you must follow him in his steps. So Peter is saying that Jesus faced a whole lot of suffering. So what did Jesus do in order to navigate through that suffering? He never sinned, nor ever deceived anyone. He He did not retaliate whenever he was insulted, nor threaten revenge when he suffered. This is a pretty good list, right? I mean, I got to admit, this is pretty good. He left his case in the hands of God, who always judges fairly. So he didn't retaliate. He said, God's going to judge this, and in the end, he's going to do better than me because he always judges fairly. He's not going to make a mistake that I would make. He personally carried our sins in his body on the cross so that we can be dead to sin and live for what is right. Peter says, you have the power inside of yourselves to do this because Jesus has given you the power to do what is right. By his wounds, you are healed. Once you were sheep who wandered away, but now you have turned to your shepherd, the guardian of your souls. Peter says, live differently as a slave. Don't give any caution or any reason for anyone to bring harm to you, to dislike you, to make your life more miserable or difficult as a slave. And your example for doing this is Jesus, who was himself a suffering servant, who was a slave, who ostensibly, Peter wants them to know, went through all the same emotions, all of the same thinking, all the same trauma that they are going through. You see, in the ancient world of slavery was property of his or her owner, who would provide just enough, the owner would provide just enough room and board so that the slave could survive long enough to get to the next day, work another day, give them room and board, but just enough room and board in order to keep them alive for the next day and the next day and the next day and the next day. But because they were property, they were not treated well. They were physically abused, they were sexually abused, they were exploited in 1,000 different ways. And that will destroy a person. It will cause a person to go mad, oftentimes, eventually, and will cause the slave owner, as they begin to start acting out on that, to become more and more increasingly heavy-handed, oftentimes, many times, leading to the death of the slave, because there's so much friction and so much difficulty. The problem is, though, is whenever we think about slavery, we don't think of slavery as a modern problem. Even in U.S. America, we don't think of slavery as being a modern issue. We look down our noses at a world that still practices slavery without realizing that in many parts of today's supposedly free Western societies like America, like Canada, we have people that are virtually in the same position as slaves as Peter did in his position as slaves back when he wrote 1 Peter. But here, they are often hidden from view. They work long hours for minimum wages. They can't take time off in order to look for another job. It is not unlike indentured servitude. They may have families to support. They may even lose a day's wages if they take off, which is going to cause a ripple effect throughout the family. It also could mean their job if they take a day off in these jobs, in these positions. So it could be disastrous to look for another job, to get sick, to take time off from this job. And so ultimately, most people who are in that situation don't. They're stuck. They're slaves to the American economy, to the businesses in which they work and live and breathe. They're slaves, essentially living as slaves here in the U.S., even in modern times. They're slaves in all but name. So if we want to sneer at these ancient societies for utilizing slavery, for being so well and good, and we are so much more progressive than they are, I don't know that we are much, if any, less barbaric than they are. We should be careful. They might actually just sneer back at us when we think about all the ways in which we have enslaved people of color, people who provide our basic services, do the jobs that we don't want to do. Oftentimes it's minimum wage or less jobs that are all paid under the table, so it can be paid any way that they want. It can be withheld, and it is slavery. So what do we get out of today's message? Well, I think what we get out of today's message is an opportunity to pause and reflect on where we stand on slavery. To pause and reflect on where we stand, on what the Bible does and does not say about slavery. I will say that I believe that the Bible is essentially anti-slavery, but I have to jump through several theological hoops in order to get to that place, because there are some passages like this one that, if not are pro-slavery, are open-minded to slavery, are not at a point of condemning it. And I have to wrestle through that. I have to wrestle through what that means, what I do with that information. Maybe the greatest problem that we have is that we don't wrestle enough. We think that the Bible is all about easy black and white answers, and it just simply isn't. All right, well, it's been good to be with you today. Make sure that you take a look at those resources at go.christstable.today/bittersweet. Download the curriculum there so that you can go deeper into today's study. And I'll look forward to being back with you tomorrow as we continue on in week